Silverbow County, Montana Territory, the 2nd of November, 1884. The frost that morning did not arrive gently, the way autumn frosts do, settling like lace on fence posts and window glass. This frost came with weight. It came with intention. It pressed against the earth like a hand pressing a pillow over a sleeping face. For Maren Dow, it carried something worse than cold. It carried the sound of a padlock snapping shut on the door of her own home. She had been a cartographer's wife, Erik Dahl. Her husband had spent 3 years mapping mineral veins for the Amalgamated Copper Company, crawling through shafts with a compass and a ledger, sketching the invisible architecture beneath the town of Garnet. He had a Dane's patience in a scientist's hands, fingers always stained with ink from his drawings. The earth had repaid his devotion by collapsing on him in the 3rd week of September, a pocket of bad air in a drift they should never have opened. They pulled him out blue. He was 31 years old. 6 weeks later, the company agent arrived. His name was Aldous Croft, a man built like a fence post, narrow and rigid, with a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who had never once questioned his own conclusions. He stood on her porch, holding a document that bore the company's seal. Mrs. Dahl, the residence is company property, allocated to active survey personnel. He did not look at her face. He looked at the door frame, as if addressing the house itself. Mr. Dahl's contract terminated upon his death. You have until tomorrow evening. My husband died in their mine, Maren said. Her accent thickened when she was tired or angry, the Danish vowels pushing through like water under ice. He died doing their work. Croft shifted his weight. For a moment something moved behind his eyes, not quite guilt, more like the shadow of a memory, perhaps of his own mother, perhaps of a time when he had been young enough to believe that fairness was something the world owed you. He cleared his throat and the shadow passed. The company offers passage to Helena on the Friday coach. I am sorry for your circumstances, Mrs. Dahl. Truly. He placed the document on the porch railing, weighted it with a stone, and walked away without turning back. That small stone on the paper, that was the weight of his sympathy. The town of Garnet had a population of 400 souls in the autumn of 1884, nearly all of them dependent on the copper company for their bread. They watched Maren's eviction the way one watches a house fire across the street, with relief that it is not your house, and a studied attention to the wind direction. Pity was a luxury. November was coming. Every cord of wood, every jar of preserved meat, every pound of flour was accounted for. A widow with no claim was not a neighbor. She was a subtraction from the communal sum. They helped her carry her things to the edge of the company road. That was the extent of it. Her possessions fit in a handcart. A trunk of clothing, a rolled mattress tick, a box of cooking implements, and a leather satchel, cracked and heavy, that contained the only inheritance Erik had left her. His survey journals, 40 leather-bound notebooks filled with his precise angular handwriting, his mineral maps, his geological cross-sections, and his observations. The miners called them his scribbles. They were worth nothing to anyone alive except her. Maren Dahl was an outsider twice over, a widow in a married town, and a Dane in an Irish and Cornish camp. Her English was good but accented, and she had the particular curse of being educated in a place that valued only muscle and ore. She had worked alongside Erik, inking his final drawings, checking his temperature readings against his mercury thermometers. She understood his work, but understanding meant nothing when the world saw only a small blonde woman with no husband and no claim. She spent her first night in the tool shed of the Lutheran church, a space the pastor allowed with the unspoken condition that she would be gone by Sunday. The cold crept through the plank walls like something alive. She did not sleep. Instead, she opened Erik's journals by the light of a tallow candle and read. Eric had been methodical to the point of obsession. He recorded everything: air temperatures at depth, water temperatures in underground streams, the way certain shafts stayed warm in winter while others froze solid. He had been fascinated by what he called the thermal constancy of depth, the principle that below a certain point the Earth maintained a steady temperature regardless of the season above. He had marked locations on his maps where warm air rose from fissures, where underground water ran at temperatures far above freezing even in January. He had written in the margin of one notebook, in Danish, a note that Maren had read a dozen times before but never truly heard until now. The surface is a fool, Maren. It believes whatever the sky tells it. But 10 feet down the earth keeps its own counsel. It remembers summer all winter long. She read those words in the tool shed with her breath visible in the candlelight, and something shifted in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something harder than hope. A decision. 3 miles northwest of Garnet, in a narrow draw that the miners called Spit Creek for the thin trickle of water that ran through it even in drought, Eric had marked something on his survey map. A small symbol, a circle with a wavy line through it, his notation for a thermal vent. Beside it, in pencil, he had written, "Warm air rising from old shaft." Collapsed entry, not worth reopening for ore. Temperature at vent 58 degrees F, measured Jan 14, 1883. 58 degrees, in January. Maren found the place on the 3rd of November. It took her most of the morning, following Eric's map through terrain that was already dusted white, her boots breaking through thin ice on the creek. The draw was sheltered, steep-sided, thick with lodgepole pine that blocked the worst of the wind. And there, exactly where his map indicated, she found the collapsed mine entrance. It was barely visible. A depression in the hillside, choked with years of deadfall and wild rose canes, their thorns black and vicious in the cold. But she could feel it, a faint exhalation of warm, mineral-scented air rising from somewhere below the rubble, like the breath of a sleeping animal. She knelt and held her bare hand over the vent. The air that touched her skin was warm. Not hot, warm. The temperature of a root cellar in August. The temperature of survival. That afternoon, she began to dig. The work was brutal and precise. She used a short-handled pick from Eric's toolbox and a flat shovel she had traded her wedding ring for at the hardware store, the proprietor avoiding her eyes as he made the exchange. The collapsed entrance was not deep. The original shaft had been a shallow exploratory drift, punched into the hillside perhaps 20 feet before the miners abandoned it for richer ground. The collapse was recent enough that the timbers were still sound beneath the fallen earth. By the end of the first day, she had cleared 4 feet of the entrance. The warm air flowed more freely now, and she could see into the darkness beyond. The shaft was intact. Low-ceilinged, barely 5 feet high, but dry. The walls were solid rock, not the crumblingite that made deeper mines so dangerous. She crawled inside on her hands and knees, holding a candle before her. The air was still, warm. It smelled of mineral dust and something faintly sulphurous, the signature of geothermal activity far below. The shaft ran straight for about 15 feet. Then opened into a small chamber where the miners had widened their drift to follow a vein that ultimately disappointed them. The chamber was perhaps 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The floor was dry, packed earth, and in the far corner, a crack in the rock floor no wider than her fist breathed the steady, invisible current of warm air from the depths below. She had found her shelter. Not a tree, not a cabin, not anything the people of Garnet would recognize as a home. A hole in the ground, a place they had thrown away. Over the following weeks, Maren transformed the abandoned drift into something remarkable. She worked from first light until her hands bled, then wrapped them in strips of petticoat and worked until dark. The process was methodical, drawn from Eric's observations and her own understanding of his principles. First she addressed the thermal vent. She did not block it. Instead, she built a simple clay chimney over the crack, shaping the wet creek bank clay with her hands and firing it slowly with small fires fed over 3 days. The chimney directed the warm air upward and along the ceiling of the chamber, where it collected before cooling and sinking. She created a circulation, a slow, constant movement of warm air that kept the chamber at a steady temperature without any fuel at all. Second, she sealed the entrance. Not completely, but with a double-door system she built from salvaged timber, creating a small vestibule between the outside and her living space. The dead air between the 2 doors acted as insulation. A principle Eric had noted in his journals about how the deepest mine shafts maintained their temperature precisely because of the distance between their openings and their depths. Third, she addressed the walls. The bare rock was a reservoir, but it needed help. She hauled creek stones, flat and dark, and stacked them along the floor near the thermal vent, creating a mass of dense material that absorbed the warmth during the day and released it slowly through the night. She plastered the walls with a mixture of clay and dried grass, not for warmth, but to prevent the rock from weeping moisture in the humidity of her breathing. By the end of November, she had a bed of pine boughs on a raised platform of stacked stones, a small cooking area near the entrance where smoke could escape through a gap she left intentionally in the upper door, and a living space that maintained a temperature Eric would have measured at approximately 55 degrees. Not warm by the standards of a well-stoked cabin, but warm enough to sleep without shivering, warm enough to keep water liquid, warm enough to live. She etched her progress on the frozen spider webs that formed each morning across the entrance of the drawer, tracing with a heated needle the routes she walked, the landmarks she used, the way back to her hidden door. It was a cartographer's habit, inherited from watching Eric. Each morning the frost provided a new canvas, and she marked it before the sun rose high enough to destroy her work. A map that existed for an hour then vanished, a daily practice of orientation, of knowing exactly where she was in a world that had told her she belonged nowhere. The last web she marked, on a morning in late November, traced the path from the creek crossing to the drawer, and at its center, she etched a small square, a home. When the sun hit the web, it glittered like a jewel for 10 minutes before collapsing into nothing. But she had already memorized it. She always did. Word reached Garnet in fragments. A trapper mentioned smoke in Spit Creek draw. A hunter found boot prints in snow where no one should be walking. Aldous Croft heard the rumors and dismissed them. "If she's alive out there, she won't be for long," he said to Silas Farrow, the mill foreman, over whiskey at the company saloon. December will finish what November started. Silas Farrow was a different kind of man than Croft. He was large, bearded, practical. He had built half the cabins in Garnet with his own hands, and he believed in the gospel of thick walls and heavy iron stoves. He had seen the Danish woman around town, small and quiet, always carrying that leather satchel of her dead husband's papers. He had thought her odd, pitiable, certainly doomed. "Digging in that old drift," Farrow said, shaking his head. "She's lost her mind. You can't live in a mine. The damp alone will kill her. Pneumonia by Christmas." The men of Garnet nodded over their drinks and agreed. It was madness. A woman playing at survival with a dead man's notebooks. They gave her 2 weeks at most. December came like a judge. It did not announce itself with the theatrical bluster of early storms. It arrived in silence, a plummeting of the mercury that was almost surgical in its precision. 20 below, 30 below, the kind of cold that split trees with a sound like gunshots in the night, that froze the creek solid to its bed, that turned breath into crystals that fell tinkling to the ground before they could dissipate. Garnet suffered. The cabins, built stout and well chinked by men like Silas Farrow, were designed to hold heat in. But holding heat required producing heat, and producing heat required fuel. The wood piles that had seemed so generous in October were shrinking at an alarming rate. Men burned twice what they had planned. The iron stoves roared day and night, consuming cord after cord, and still the coal found its way through the gaps where chinking had shrunk, through the frozen ground beneath the floorboards, through the single-pane glass that might as well have been open air. By the third week of December, 3 families had consolidated into one cabin to share body heat and fuel. The company store raised prices on kerosene. 2 old-timers on the edge of town were found frozen in their beds, their stove cold, and their woodpile exhausted. The town was surviving, but only barely, and the winter was not half done. In the drawer called Spit Creek, Marindal slept without shivering. The thermal vent breathed its steady warmth into her chamber. The clay chimney distributed it evenly. The stone mass along the floor held it through the longest nights. She burned a small fire only for cooking, a handful of sticks that produced more light than heat because heat was already provided. Her fuel consumption was negligible. A dead branch lasted her 3 days. The earth itself was her stove, and it never went out. She had insulated the entrance further as the cold deepened, packing dried grass between the double doors until the vestibule was nearly airtight. The temperature in her chamber never dropped below 50 degrees. She read Eric's journals by candlelight. She mended her clothes. She slept deeply and woke rested. The mountain did not fight the winter. It simply continued being the mountain. On the 4th of January, 1885, the worst blizzard in territorial memory descended on Silverbow County. It lasted 3 days. Winds that stripped the snow from the ground and drove it horizontal, packing it against the north face of every structure until some cabins were buried to their rooflines. The temperature dropped to 42 below zero. At that temperature, exposed flesh freezes in under 2 minutes. Spit falls and shatters before it hits the ground. Garnett lost 7 souls in that storm. 7. Among them was the company doctor, whose cabin stood on the exposed north ridge and whose stovepipe was torn away by the wind in the first night. They found him huddled beneath every blanket he owned, his medical bag clutched to his chest as if it might save him. It could not. When the storm broke on the 7th of January, the survivors emerged into a world that looked alien. Drifts 20 feet high. The sky a pale, washed blue that seemed mocking in its serenity. Silas Farrow stood on his porch and looked at the devastation. His own chimney had cracked. His wife and children had spent the last night of the storm in the root cellar, wrapped in horse blankets, weeping. He thought of the Danish woman. He thought of her with the grim certainty of a man tallying the dead. But beneath that certainty something nagged. The trapper's report. Smoke in the drawer, boot prints in snow. If she had been alive before the storm, surely now she was dead. But if she was not, if somehow she was not, he had to know. The walk to Spit Creek took him 2 hours through waist-deep snow. He was exhausted and frost-nipped by the time he reached the drawer. The pines had sheltered it somewhat, and the snow was shallower here, packed hard by the channeled wind. He smelled it before he saw it. Wood smoke. Thin, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. He followed the drawer to its end and found the entrance. The double doors, crude but effective, were clear of snow. A thin gull of smoke rose from a gap in the upper frame. And as he stood there, his chest heaving, his certainty crumbling like wet chalk, the inner door opened. Marindal stood before him. She was thin. Her hands were rough and chapped, but her eyes were clear, her color was good, and she was not shivering. Behind her, he could see the glow of a small fire, and he could feel it. Warmth, radiating from the dark opening like breath from a living thing. He stared at her. She looked back at him without expression. 7 dead in town, he said finally. His voice was hoarse. Doc Alderman, the Krantz children, old Pete Simonson and his wife. He listed them like a confession. Maren closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was no satisfaction there. No vindication, only a sadness that seemed to encompass not just the dead, but the entire monstrous stupidity of pride. "Come inside," she said. "You are frostbitten on your left ear." Silas Farrow ducked through the low entrance and stepped into the chamber. The warmth folded around him like water. He stood motionless for a long time, his hands at his sides, feeling the impossible. Warm air rising from the floor, warm stone beneath his boots. A temperature that his body registered as spring while a killing winter raged 50 feet above and behind him. He removed his glove and pressed his palm flat against the plastered wall. Warm. Actively, steadily warm, with no fire large enough to account for it. He looked at the small hearth near the entrance, where a few sticks smoldered, barely enough to heat a cup of water. Then he looked at the clay chimney over the crack in the floor, the subtle current of air it directed upward. "How?" he said. The word came out broken. Maren poured him a cup of hot water from a kettle that sat on a flat stone near the vent. "The earth is warm beneath us," she said simply. Eric knew. He measured it. "You build your houses on the surface and fight the cold. I went below the surface, where the cold cannot reach. The mountain does not fight the winter. It simply waits and stays warm, and the winter passes over it like a bird over a lake." Farrow drank the hot water and felt it move through him. He thought of his cracked chimney, his weeping children in the root cellar, his certainty that this woman was mad. "Mrs. Dahl," he said. His voice was quiet. "I said you were digging your own grave. I remember. I was wrong." He set the cup down on the stone floor. "Can you teach me what you know?" "Yes," she said, and there was nothing else to say about it. Silas Farrow returned to Garnet and spoke plainly. He was not a man given to embellishment, and his reputation made his words land with force. Within a week, a delegation of 12 men made the trek to Spit Creek. Maren showed them everything: the vent, the clay chimney, the stone mass, the double-door vestibule, the principles of thermal constancy that Eric had documented so precisely in his notebooks. She did not ask for payment. She did not remind them of the padlock on her door, or the stone on the eviction notice, or the way they had watched from their windows as her possessions were set in the snow. She taught them as Eric had taught her, with patience and precision, pointing to specific pages in his journals where the measurements proved what her survival had demonstrated. That winter did not end easily, but Garnet adapted. Farrow led the effort, retrofitting cellars with thermal mass, digging berms against north walls, sealing foundations with clay packing. 3 families moved their living quarters into their root cellars entirely, insulating them from above, and finding that the earth-sheltered spaces required a fraction of the fuel their cabins had demanded. The death toll stopped at 7. By spring, Maren Dahl's name had traveled beyond Garnet. Ranchers in the Deer Lodge Valley wrote to her. A territorial newspaper sent a correspondent who described her shelter as a masterwork of applied geology. Aldous Croft, still employed by the company, passed her on the main street one April morning. He tipped his hat. He did not speak. She did not expect him to. Some reckonings are silent, and silence was enough. Maren never moved back into town. She expanded her shelter over the years, adding a second chamber, a proper ventilation system, a root cellar that stayed cool in summer by the same principles that kept it warm in winter. Eric's journals sat on a shelf she carved into the rock wall, their leather covers softening with age. Their pages visited by students and builders who came from as far as Helena and Butte to understand what the Danish cartographer had known and his wife had proved. She lived there for 37 years. The draw they stopped calling Spit Creek. They called it Dow's Hollow, and the warm breath of the earth still rose from it on January mornings, visible as a faint mist against the frozen air, long after the woman who had found it was gone. Now I want to ask you something, not about Montana in 1884, about you, about right now. What knowledge have you inherited that the world has told you is useless? What journal sits unopened on your shelf? What skill passed down from someone who loved you has been dismissed as impractical, outdated, irrelevant? What warmth lies beneath the surface of your life, 10 feet below the conventional wisdom that keeps failing you every winter? The people around you will build their walls thicker. They will burn more fuel. They will do the same thing harder and call it effort. And they will shiver. What forgotten entrance are you walking past every day, choked with brush, dismissed as worthless, collapsed and abandoned by people who were looking for gold when the real treasure was warmth? Your earth is warm beneath you. Your map is already drawn. The knowledge is already yours, written in a hand you recognize, waiting for you to trust it more than you trust the voices that said it was madness. Start digging. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival and geothermal shelter. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.